For anybody that does follow us over on Twitter, I have no idea if that's a command. Probably not. It's probably like down below. But for anybody that follows us over on Twitter, I have been tweeting out kind of some updates around some A Realm Revoiced related projects. As I dive into A Realm Revoiced, I've been asking some kind of questions, and there's kind of some shorter projects that'll probably come online first. All of this started when my computer showed up, so I've been redrawing the Eorzean map, and for two reasons. First of all, this map, you can't zoom in that much, right? Like, you can only zoom in this far. And so you kind of get stuck. It's also, like, weird at first glance. Like, that's the smoke from Mount Ngoro. That's not part of the island. So, like, there's parts of it that are just fragments and, like, shreds in the paper. There's higher res versions of this available out on the internet. This is the map that people print out and, like, is on, like, Pyromancer's wall. The second thing is that this map is not wildly helpful when you get up into these areas that are covered. There are some maps that, like, some of these clouds have been cleared, but there's also a lot of maps that aren't. They're not cleared. And so it's really hard to kind of know where everything is. Even when they translate things. Like, this is Old Sharlayan. That's the actual Sharlayan. That's Ishgard, Redania, Girabanya, Thavnair. Well, that's Thavnair. That's Radzithan. Othard. This is Doma. And this is Kugane. So, like, just to give everybody a sense of where we are. And the other problem is, as I've gone in and laid this out, this is wrong. Like, it's just objectively inaccurate. It's inaccurate for a number of reasons. I do think what they were trying to do was they were trying to get a game out in 18 months, and they hired a map artist to make a general big map. Meanwhile, they're trying to manage the zone maps at the same time, and they were not lining those up. They did not make one big map and then cut it into pieces for our zone maps. The zone maps were allowed to do what they needed to do for gameplay, and so it breaks a lot of this. And they were trying to salvage what they could from 1.0. So 1.0 kind of put them in a spot where they couldn't draw the world from scratch. But what that means is, like, let's look at Lenosha, for example. So Lenosha is right here. So down off this southern end, right? So it's hard to kind of see. But the continent does this. So the continent comes up here. It actually comes around this bend. This is all land. And then it bends this corner. And there's some islands here that are not documented. As you come along down past Costa del Sol, it passes down to Lower Lenosha. The mist is over here. Which, like, what? What? Like, I always think of the mist as being tied to Limsa. It's not. It's not. It's over here. Limsa's over here. And in between is Lower Lenosha. And the continent, if we go back and look, so that makes, like, this the mist. And that's not right. It should be a little bit bigger and a lot closer. And then this actually has a bridge and comes out to, like, another island that's underneath this Limsa label that's not shown. You'd see the bottom of it. That makes this a much narrower strait, like the Strait of Melthor here. The Strait of Melthor is likely in Garlean control, because there's a Garlean outpost, like, here and here. And so, like, this is likely how the Garleans are getting everything past Ishgard, is they're coming down through this strait. And so, but what's interesting is then we get out on the Ratano Sea, but I think the Ratano Sea cuts down to, like, a small strait right here. And I think right here there's 3 main islands. There might be little fragments around that to make it feel more like an archipelago, but there's 3 main islands. The small one here is going to be Loch's Lie. And so, no, the mist is out here. Go look back. It's on the other side of Lower Lenosha. The small islands is Wolf's Den. These islands here are nothing. Wolf's Den is way out here. Look at it. That's out in the middle of nothing. And there's a bridge. It's just wrong. Like, it's just objectively wrong. This is way pointier. And in this section here, doesn't exist. So if we go look at this, Western Lenosha shoots around here almost straight. It never bells out. Even when we go to Western Lenosha, it never bells out. Right? Except for Aleport. Right here. Which is an island. So if we back up, there's an island out here where this boat is, and that little nub right there isn't there. This map is not before the Calamity. The 1.0 maps are nuts. So let's just take all pre-Calamity 1.0 data, and let's just put that out of our mind, because that makes this problem worse, not better. So I looked at those. And so what I'm doing, and I tweeted out an image last night, around midnight. If I go to my Twitter, is I'm redrawing it, but I'm doing it in sections. So I did the rough outline, and then I'm replacing their rum lines because their rum lines are wrong. And so I've done this section here, and actually just after this image I did down here. So I've done this section correctly. But over this, I have overlays of all the zone maps, and then I needed to be able to get in game to verify to make sure that those were lined up correctly. So by using the world map and the zone maps and being in game, I think I can correct this coastline. And that'll give me a correct bottom 3/4. I'll never get the top correct because, like, we never go to Mount Ngoro or above. So from, like, right here to right here, everything above that line, basically everything above this text, we don't know is better. So I am taking 1.0 as when Yoshi P talks about 1.0 and being canon, he also tends to do this a lot. And so I am taking that as if I want to ignore 1.0 maps, I will. Are all the zones actually next to each other? No, kind of. So what happens is outer and upper Lenosha, those maps actually directly overlay because of Camp Bronze Lake. Eastern and lower Lenosha are very close together. They're very, very close. That's a very narrow gap. This extends it for graphical reasons. But they actually line up really nicely. Middle and Western Lenosha line up really nicely. Western kind of touches upper. Upper kind of touches Eastern. And what you end up in the middle is a donut of nothingness. And middle to Eastern Lenosha goes through that donut. They just go straight through it. And then Limps is kind of in a weird spot. So, like, lower is probably the big offender in being, like, the big one that proves that this map here is a lie. The question is, if this map's a lie, why is it still the map in circulation? It's posted on walls. It's given to adventurers. And so I think there's, like, a legitimate thing here. When you go understand, like, inaccuracies in mapping, basically everything after, like, the year 1500, if a map was inaccurate on Earth, it is because there was geopolitical pressure on that map. It was not ineptitude. It was you're seeing the tone of society. Because from the 1500s on, we had correct projections. So we had the Mercator projections that actually are very, very similar to what, like, Google Earth is run off of. From, like, the 1500s. So, like, it's been that long. We all think about, here in the US, we're taught that, like, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and, like, they thought the Earth was flat and they set out to prove. No. As of the 1500s, the Mercator projection was widely circulated and used for navigation. That's another issue that I have with this map that I've corrected, is I think somebody was graphically taking these rum lines here, centered around these windroses, and they were moving these. Windroses are used for navigation. There's a couple ways of placing them, but they should be in circles. Well, the hexadecagons. But if there's one here, there should be one directly above it, which there is. And then there should be one about here, which means there should be one over here, and that one's been moved. So these are navigation lines, and the reason you move them like that is because then all of their inter-cardinals line up really nicely, except on the edges of the circle. So on the edge of the circle, you do end up with these kind of like duplicate parallel lines like this. That actually does happen, but you don't have duplicate parallels, duplicate parallels, duplicate parallels, duplicate parallels. It doesn't happen that often. They're more interspaced. They look a lot more like, they actually space a lot more like a Mercator, where they're pretty even, relatively even, and then as you slide out, these slide further apart. They slide closer together at the ends. So they're kind of like that, where they get screwed up on the outsides. But when you're in between, it's actually all pretty square if you just do your norths and souths. And so they really help like accentuate the Mercator. And the reason people use a Mercator projection is that it always keeps east-east, west-west, north-north, and south-south. So it's really important for sailing. And so to have a map this inaccurate circulating and then travel predominantly by sea and wind is alarming. So yesterday, as I thought about it, because I thought back over the stream, we flew from Gridania to Lenosha. Now, as somebody that doesn't know all the story, but does know all the places, that's a weird path to take. Especially if you think about the fact that the Garleans have a base here, they have a base here, they have stuff up here. So, like, they likely own this strait from a strategic standpoint. So when they're like, well, we have to limit airships because we keep losing airships. Duh. Like, duh. Why are you not coming out here past the edge of Alamigo? Right? Alamigo's here. Why are you not coming out past Alamigo and coming around the outside tip of Thanalan? And then popping from Thanalan over Lenosha? Because seafarers aren't going to come this way, because this gets really misty. This is, so like the flat island, probably this one, is probably Locker's Lie. These aren't labeled, but there's 3 islands out here. Locker's Lie is used for Grand Company trainings. And so it's super, super flat, and it's used for like big open space trainings in the same way that like France tested early nuclear weapons on Fiji. Then out here, this is, one of these is Hullbreaker Isle. And so like I don't have that labeled anywhere on a map. It's not labeled, but I'm pretty sure it's out here. I'd have to switch characters and see if they label it, but I'm pretty sure this is Hullbreaker Isle. And Hullbreaker Isle is like a treasure-based island that's surrounded in mists. And so like you're not going to have sailors approaching Hullbreaker, which means if they come down this strait, they're going to go back up this strait. They're not coming out the bottom. So why in the world yesterday did we take our airship from the Black Shroud to Lenosha instead of the Black Shroud to Thanalan? Because what we ended up doing yesterday, as I thought back over the stream, is we went Black Shroud to Lenosha, Lenosha to Thanalan, Thanalan to Lenosha. And it should have been Black Shroud to Thanalan, get all of our stuff out of the way, and then go to Lenosha. It's not only less trips, but it's objectively safer. So the more I get to know about this map, the more there's like some really weird stuff that makes people very human. I also think there's some very large ramifications for who gave us this map. If we take the inaccuracies not as a result of the devs building the game in 18 months and say, Chris, it's just a game, stop staring at it, then you have to assume that the map was drawn with somebody who was underinformed in the game, canonically, which is unlikely that they would still be in circulation, right? That would be corrected. So we can remove that. Or the same reason that a lot of inaccurate maps were circulated in the 16, 17, and 1800s, because they served to align with societal pressures. A lot of the projections, a lot of the problems with the Mercator projections and things like that that are circulated is that, like, yes, they're very good for navigation, but they're very bad for scale. And so they tend to make things like Britain and Iceland look bigger. But they tend to make things like Africa look smaller. If you go look at a world map right here, everything up here looks too large in this direction. It's correct in this direction. So Russia really does span 11 time zones. But as you look up, Greenland here, looks the same size as Africa, ballpark. It's 1/14th the land area. It's not. And like, people will do stuff like this to be like, oh, I put it on a circle. But that's not how globes work. Like, this is a projection. When it wraps on the circle, everything shrinks back down. And so when you go look at like a physical world map here, look at how much smaller it looks. But like, you can't drive a boat on this map. You can't do it. Right? But Greenland to Africa are much closer to their correct size. But like, not only is this good for navigation, but this is also good for imperialism. So if you think about the maps being circulated at the time, the UK looking any smaller and Africa looking any bigger starts to make you wonder why in the world this tiny country was allowed to like own this and own this and own this and own this. Like, what is happening? You know, this section of the world had colonies spread from here all the way around. And so projections are a big part of that, because when you see a map, you go, oh, they just own this. But like, when you see how big Africa's enormous. But because it falls at the equator, the way a Mercator projection gets inaccurate is that the circumference, right, that the circle, the perimeter of a circle is smaller as you work your way up a globe. So the further you get to the edge, the more inaccurate it gets. So Greenland is the most inaccurate, Africa is the most accurate. And so as a result, that makes Africa look tiny compared to how much Greenland benefits. So if we think of this map as inaccurate, but knowingly inaccurate, knowingly and willingly inaccurate, then that means somebody is circulating an inaccurate map because it benefits them. And so the question is, who does this benefit? And what's crazy is, like, this game has an old enough history that it doesn't have to benefit anybody current. It could benefit Old Sherlan. It could benefit Allegans. It could benefit the current empire. Can you imagine the drama if we found out this map was being circulated by the Empire? Somebody gave us this map, and so somebody is spreading a lie. A complete lie. So, since I want to do some videos about this, I need a correct map. So if you guys keep following me on Twitter, I'll keep updating you as the map gets further along. But I am drawing an accurate map from a flat Earth standpoint. So like, I'm not going to adjust for projection. So it won't be perfect. Like, it won't wrap. So you won't be able to use it for navigation because distances between things won't be correct. But the scale of the individual places will be this. So it'll be most likely very Mercator-y. In that Mercators also represent ideal coastlines. And so the other good thing about Mercators is that if you protect your cardinals, then you know if north is north, south is south, east is east, and west is west, you know that the shape of this coastline is the shape of this coastline. But this map is not that accurate. This coastline doesn't look like this. And this is really a problem because we navigate by sea. And since there are weather patterns, there are mists here, you know that they're not just navigating by sight. Now, the reason Mercators were in circulation, and are still in circulation, is they are very good for navigation. The only thing that has allowed us since roughly the 1950s to basically start moving into maps that can do a better job meeting the context of the situation, where we can have maps that are drawn for entertainment, we have maps that show us, there are projections out there that help kind of make sure everything's the correct scale, there's maps out there that help kind of show everything within relevance to each other on a circle, there's all these different weird shapes, and the reason we can afford to stray from the universal Mercator is that we no longer need them for navigation. We can now use maps for information, and that's it. They don't have to be used as a form of directions. And that is because we now have GPS. We now have a global system of satellites that tells us no matter where we are, with increasing accuracy, at this point it's like within like 3 feet on a personal device, it can tell us where we are in the world. And so I don't need a correct coastline, because if I'm on a boat and it has GPS, I can update from there. The United States Coast Guard has things sent to them in GPS coordinates, and then their system on board maps it out. They don't need to have maps handed to them that they roll out anymore. They don't have to have that. Computer systems can handle all of this, and it helps them with all sorts of fancy search patterns that do optimize for drift and flow, and if they're large enough, the natural curvature of the Earth and the depth of what's below, all of this extra information, because we're not reliant on paper maps anymore. So, if there is a paper map this inaccurate, that is in wide circulation in Eorzea, it's not just us. If you go check, like, in Endwalker, if you go into our little hall or whatever, I believe this is on the wall. In Sestasha, this is on the wall, but it's different. It's a pirates map, and I think it's Lenosha focused. And so, like, but like maps they're posted, they're public. Everybody else has this map. And that, you could say, oh, well, that's because the game didn't define multiple sprite sheets. No. Screw all that. Let's assume everything's canon. So that means that there has to be GPS in Final Fantasy XIV, which means in the top right of my map here, there are coordinates. Those are not a player-user interface. They might be for our adventurer, but they are canonical coordinates in that boats have to have access to the same coordinates, or they cannot navigate this coastline. So there has to be a form of GPS, but we don't have satellites. Which means there is likely Allagan technology giving us GPS, and I'm betting that they nested it inside the Aetherites. That's my bet. It's just Aether. No. You can't trust the written lore. Because the written lore is written by people so far after the Calamity that they would have inherited a lot of this. These are people that can't remember my freaking face. You can't trust the written lore. You have to take the written lore and say, what information were they interpreting to write this lore? And how may they have been misled by Allagans and the Ancients? Ether currents is a whole other conversation. It can't just be Ether, because Ether doesn't care if it breaches a ship's hull pushing too close to the coast. Ether doesn't care. It can't be just Ether currents. It can't be. Because if there's an Ether current flowing along this coast, right? What happens if you hit those? You're in the fog, you don't see them. You're gonna hit them. They have to be mapped. This right here is not even on that map. There's nothing out here. There's nothing out here. Nothing. There's nothing out here. So, all of this is stuff that I found out while diving into A Realm Revoiced, and I ended up with all of this is stuff that is in A Realm Revoiced, and I have a video coming up, the script is written, that proves that Aetheris... It proves Aetheris' axial tilt. I've reached out to people that know a lot more about Final Fantasy XIV lore than me to make sure that that stuff's correct. And then I've gone over with some friends the math to make sure that the astrophysics portion is correct. But I believe I found the axial tilt of Aetheris, and like it has huge canonical ramifications. Because it means that the ancients understood axial tilt. They have to have. You can't run something like Elpis and not understand axial tilt. You need to know about it and you need to account for it. You can't have that.